Hi everybody, welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. It has been a hot minute since I have posted anything on this channel at all. And so much has happened that I need to update you guys on, but I felt the best comeback video that I could start with would of course be a book related video. So I thought I would start with all of the books that I've read so far this year in 2025. Now for reference, in case you're watching this video in the future, it is currently the end of August 2025, so a little over half of the year has gone by, and honestly, I've not been doing as good with reading as I feel like I should be. Now, I know that the number of books that you read doesn't really matter, and keeping count also doesn't really matter. Everyone has their own reading levels, and really it just matters if you're enjoying yourself or not. But I typically would have read a significant amount more books by this point in the year than I have this year. I noticed that the number one thing that's kind of stopped me from reading as much is just the amount of things going on in my life recently. I feel like reading just hasn't been a big priority. It's actually been extremely hard for me to just sit down and kind of focus, which is a pretty big aspect of reading a book. One of the life events that happened that I'm kind of going to blame on part of the reason why I haven't read as much is something you might be able to tell by my change in background. So me and my boyfriend Aaron bought our first house together earlier this year in April. I'm not going to get into too many details about it in this video, but I will say that has been a major contributor in me not reading as much. That and me going through an awful bout of anxiety that lasted about 4 months straight earlier this year, I would say are the two big contributing factors to why I haven't read as much. But I would still say I'm doing pretty good. I've read more nonfiction this year than I ever have in the past, and I feel like I've really been getting deeper into the books and only reading books that I really enjoy or that I feel I have a good reason to read. Now, starting off with the first book that I read this year, I read Lucid Dying by Dr. Sam Parnia. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this book. I actually borrowed it from my local library. I had never heard of this book before until I was in my library and I saw it on their new releases shelf. And of course, knowing me, I saw anything to do with dying and I was like, okay, yeah, let me go check it out. Now, Lucid Dying comes off as kind of a morbid sounding book, but it is honestly one of the most fascinating nonfiction books I think I've ever read. It was one of those books that when I picked it up, I really didn't want to stop reading. I just wanted to keep going, but at the same time I wanted to make it last longer because it was just such a fascinating topic. Dr. Parnia's research focuses all on near-death experiences, specifically when a person has clinically died, their heart has stopped, their brain has ceased functioning, and then they are brought back to life several minutes later. What do they experience in those minutes that they are gone? In those minutes that they are actually dead, what do people remember? What do they experience? Now, majority of people don't remember anything when they go through a near-death experience, but those people that do have memories have a lot in common with what they experienced during their short time in death. The book starts off looking at some research around resuscitation. Now, if you think back in the day before CPR was really a thing, when you were dead, you were just dead. But then when CPR was invented, it made the definition of death a little bit more ambiguous for us. For example, if someone dies, but then they're able to be brought back 5 minutes later, it's a little unclear on where death really begins and where the afterlife begins in this sense. The book starts off with this research being done in pigs, where we have these pig heads, these pigs that have been decapitated, and scientists have been able to basically turn the brains back online despite them being in a decapitated pig head, proving that they're able to bring a brain back without suffering the damages of oxygen deprivation that we typically see when someone has been clinically dead for too long. And with this kind of forward momentum, this new research, Dr. Parnia really started to think, what are the implications of this morally and ethically? If you can have someone who has been dead for up to 24 hours be brought back to life, based on the fact that there's no damage to their body, what does this mean for what they experienced while they're dead? We already have a lot of people who have these near-death experiences when they've been dead for only a few minutes, but if we start having people that have been dead for hours up to even a full day, he feels like there's going to be even more of these near-death experiences coming through if we get to that point. So basically, this whole book just focuses on his research and detailing these near-death experiences, seeing the shared experiences, what they have in common, what they don't have in common, and it was such a fascinating book to read about. And honestly, even if you're not super into talking about death, this is not a very morbid book, despite me mentioning the decapitated pig heads. Actually, this book is very hopeful in the way that it's formatted, and I feel like it kind of gives a very scientific approach to being hopeful about death and coming to peace with death. Now, I will say I did rate this book 4 stars. Now, the reason that it did not get the full 5-star rating from me is just sometimes the author, Dr. Parnia, had a bit of an attitude when it came to addressing people's counterpoints to his arguments. And for me, that just sets off a red flag personally. If you're not able to kind of validate people's arguments, if you're not able to, use research, use science to back what you're saying, if you're kind of approaching it from an emotional perspective, it does set off some red flags for me. So for that reason, I only made it a 4-star, but honestly, the read itself, other than that, was like a 5-star experience, and I highly recommend it. And please let me know if you've read this book. I don't know anyone else that has, and I am just dying to talk with someone, literally anyone, about it because it is just so fascinating. The second book that I read this year is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. Now, I also don't have the physical copy of this book because I did get it again from my library. Now, I will say The Familiar is one of the most beautiful books I feel like I've ever seen. I remember when this book was first released, I would see it in Target, I would see it in Barnes & Noble, and it was just such a gorgeous book. It has this very gothic vibe to it, and it just drew me in. But for some reason, I didn't read it for like a year or two after it released. When I saw that it was available in my library, I immediately snatched up a copy because I was so excited to read it, to dive in. I'd heard such good things about it. Now, if I'm being honest, this book for me personally was really only at 3.75 stars, which for me is not a bad rating. I know some people feel like anything under 4 stars is not good, but that's really not true. 3.75 for me is above average and still a very enjoyable book. In fact, this is almost 4 stars. My main issue with The Familiar is that it was so difficult for me to get into. I don't know if it was like the time period that it's set in or the setting itself, but I just could not get into it. I remember picking it up and not wanting to read it and setting it down several times. I actually almost ran out of the time period I had from the library to read it because I just couldn't make myself sit down and finish it. But I was super determined to read this book, so when I finally sat down and read it, I ended up getting very attached to the characters and the storyline as a whole, so that by the end of the book, I absolutely loved it. It was such a good book, but I had to knock down some points because I really didn't like it when I was first reading it. Now, The Familiar is a really interesting book. This book basically follows this girl who is able to practice this form of magic, but this is during a time when it's really dangerous to be able to perform magic, especially as a woman. This girl has lost both of her parents and she's working as a maid or a servant for this upper class family, and she gets caught by the woman of the family practicing magic. Now, the woman tries to take advantage of her servant's ability to practice magic to kind of boost her standings in the social hierarchy, so she has her perform for her at parties. But this performance at parties ends up getting her some negative attention, and she's forced to run or face being called a witch and possibly executed for the magic that she's doing. This whole book takes place in a setting where it's very much like the Inquisition kind of vibes. I don't know if that's the right comparison, but it's very much everything that you do should be holy, should be for God, should be for the church. And at this point, anyone could really point fingers and say that somebody practicing magic was doing it for the devil, but another person could say they were doing it for God. And it was really up to the king's interpretation over whether this person was doing something holy or doing something demonic. Now, our main character ends up kind of getting wrapped up in this scheme to go and compete in this challenge to perform for the king to see who can be his next magician, quote unquote, for this war that he's in. But the trick is that they have to be coming from a very godly place with their magic. So despite her having this magic and not really being part of this religion, and in fact her magic, I think from my memory, it's been a while since I've read the book, but from my memory, I believe it almost has like Jewish origins. She kind of has to pretend that it is this very Christian-based magic as she competes. She has different trials that she has to go through and competitors that she faces up against, and she works with her love interest as she learns to harness this magic that she's always had to keep hidden. Again, I really did enjoy this book. It was just a little bit difficult for me to get into in the beginning, so if you're interested in reading it, I would definitely give it a chance, but just know it might take a little bit to get into it. All right, so this next book was my first book that I read after having a several month-long gap in reading, and that is This Is Your Brain on Anxiety by Faith G. Harper. Now, this is a very thin, tiny, little bitty book, as you can see. In fact, it almost feels more appropriate to call it like a booklet than an actual book itself. It is 63 pages long. So I read this in under an hour. I think I finished it in like 30 minutes maybe. It was very quick read and a book that I picked up at my local bookstore. Now, as you might imagine from the title, I picked this book up when I was going through some really bad anxiety. Earlier this year, I suffered through a really bad 4-month, 5-month spiral of health anxiety, and it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Towards the later half of that anxiety spiral, I picked this book up at my local bookstore, thinking that maybe it could give me some insight into what was going on with my body and maybe some tips or tricks I could use to help calm myself down. Now, this is a 5-star book. Of course, you know, it's not very big, but the information in it is super, super useful. This book really just explains what's going on with your body when you're in an anxious state, the different factors in your environment and in your behaviors that can affect your anxiety. And it was just really helpful to me when I was going through my anxiety to realize some of the things I was doing that was kind of adding on to my already anxious state. For example, we all know sleep is important, but I didn't realize exactly how much impact sleep had on my mental health until I went through the spiral. Now I'm aware that if I go several days in a row with poor quality sleep, whether that's not enough sleep or sleeping enough but it being bad sleep, it really affects my mental health negatively. So again, it is a pretty small book. I would definitely try to get the ebook version if you can. You probably could save some money there, but I definitely recommend it. It's just kind of a good little informational booklet for anxiety, but a pretty quick read, but I still count it. All right, now jumping into some more fiction, we have Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. Now, if anyone knows me, you have to know that I am such a big Hunger Games fan. I was one of the weird little kids that was always, you know, doing this out in public. I went and saw all the movies in theaters. I read all of the books. I love the Hunger Games. It carries this kind of nostalgia for me now as an adult, but also as an adult, I've reread through the series and I can see the messages in these books and I can see beyond just the plot and the characters that I loved as a kid. So of course, when I saw that Sunrise on the Reaping was coming out, I knew that I was going to read it and I had to get my own copy. Now, this was a 5-star read for me. I do think that this could potentially be just partially me being biased because I love the Hunger Games series as a whole. I do feel like if you were to read this book without having read any of the other Hunger Games books, you would maybe just kind of feel meh about it. I think this book was kind of written with the intention of being read by people that were already very much aware of what's going on in this universe. And I don't want to call it fan service, but I think that the main reason that you care about the characters in this book is because you know about them from the other books that they're in later on. I would also say, knowing that it's a prequel, it kind of takes the stakes out of what happens in the book a little bit because you already kind of know what's going to happen just based on what's already happened in the original trilogy series. Based on what happened in the original book series, you kind of already know what's going to happen. You just don't know how you're going to get there in this series. So I will say a lot of that kind of took me away from connecting with the characters because I just already knew what was going to happen to most of them. Now, if you're not familiar with the Hunger Games series, I definitely recommend starting with the original trilogy or original 4-book series, because those are definitely the best in my opinion, and they really set the standard and set the world up in such a good way, and the messages that Suzanne Collins includes in those books are so relevant to the world today. But Sunrise on the Reaping is a prequel to that series. It specifically follows one of the characters from the original series, Haymitch, as he goes through his Hunger Games when he was a teenager. Now, Suzanne Collins has said before that she only writes a book when she has a message and has something she wants to say, and her message was loud and clear in this book. So I definitely recommend reading it if you loved the Hunger Games series, but if you haven't read the originals yet, I would read those first before going to this one. All right, we have another anxiety book. Your girl was going through it. This book is The Anatomy of Anxiety: Understanding and Overcoming the Body's Fear Response by Dr. Ellen Vora. I picked this book up at my local bookstore, had never heard of it before, but it sounded interesting, and it was on, I think, like their bestseller shelf or something like that. It had a lot of interest in it, so that's partially why I picked it up. This was another book that I was reading towards the end of my anxiety spiral when I was kind of looking for some answers on how to help my anxiety, things I could change, implement, that kind of thing. Now, unfortunately, despite the hype around this book, this was only a 2.5-star book for me, which is a pretty average book, and I honestly considered rating it even lower than that. I really, really wanted to like this book. I really did, but I couldn't. This book has a lot of really good information in it, especially around like the different things that affect anxiety, from physical things to patterns you have in your diet to thought patterns, those kind of things. But what really dragged down the rating for this book is just the amount of, I almost don't know what to call it. I almost want to say like woo-woo, but that feels like a not great term to use. There was just a lot of like one-off anecdotes that the author included as like a foolproof method for curing anxiety, if that makes sense. So she would have clients she would work with, and they would find that something like a coffee enema helped get rid of their anxiety, and then she would put it in the book as if that was like a, yeah, do it. Like, and I don't think that that's good practice to do that. I feel like it's a bit misleading where she kind of just put everything that had ever worked for any of her patients ever in the book, even if there's not really any science backing it, or it could be harmful, or it's kind of just, you know, maybe a one-off that it worked, but she just kind of put it in there anyway. So that was my main qualm with this book, is there is a mix of science-based, science-backed, you know, things in this book, and then there was a mix of like this personal gnosis of things that her clients had experienced. Also, her tone overall was a little bit for me. She kind of acted like she was, I don't know, superior, if that makes sense. The tone was just a bit off for me personally. It's hard to say I wouldn't recommend this book because there were some really good pieces of information in here. Like, for example, she breaks down anxiety into like 2 categories: the anxiety caused by physical imbalances in the body, and then anxiety caused by you subconsciously knowing that you're in a state or in an area of your life that you don't want to be, and that kind of pushing you to change where you are. And I did like that. I also liked her talks over the impacts of sleep and hunger and inflammation and your diet and exercise on your anxiety, because these are things that I feel like we all kind of subconsciously know. We know that the way we treat our body physically affects our mental health, but she really broke it down in a way where I was like, oh no, it really does affect our body. Like, for example, of course, I knew sleep was big impact for anxiety. The previous book I mentioned talked a lot about that, but I didn't realize that when your blood sugar gets low, it also triggers your body's stress response. So if you're not eating regularly, if you're letting yourself get hungry, that can also trigger stress. So I guess I would say for this book, if you're going to read it, take it with a grain of salt. Don't take it as everything in here is absolutely true. Just, I feel like use common sense. You know, if it's something that's very anecdotal, take it that way. If she has the research backing it up, then you know there's a little bit more behind it. I would just take it with a grain of salt. All right, the next book I don't have a physical copy of. I borrowed it as an ebook from my library, and that is Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. Now, this book popped up on my Libby app, and I was super excited because I am such a die-hard Ali Hazelwood fan. I absolutely love her books. I love the way that she writes. Honestly, I would say, and not in a derogatory way at all, her books are never like super life-changing for me, but they just always put me in a good mood. They're just always a fun, easy read. They kind of get me back into reading when I've been gone for a while, or if I just read a book I didn't really enjoy. And so I was super excited to see that Deep End was available to borrow on Libby, and I ate it up. I actually read it while I was on a trip to Alaska earlier this year. Now, if you're not super familiar with Ali Hazelwood, she's written a bunch of other romance books. I think her most popular one is The Love Hypothesis, which I think they're making a movie over right now. I'm super excited for that. But she writes these kind of cutesy STEM-based romance books typically. So most of her previous books have revolved about people that are deep in research, whether that's like med students or they're in engineering or whatever it is. But this book specifically follows 2 college students that are both in athletics, I guess swim-based athletics. I don't know what the word is for that. The main character, she is a competitive diver in college, and the main male character is a competitive swimmer in college. So we're kind of following them as they meet each other and kind of develop this relationship. This relationship is based off of them both being into each other's kinks, basically. So they kind of start up a situationship, but then they develop feelings, and you know, it kind of goes from there. There's a lot of drama, a lot of cute scenes. It's just a very enjoyable and also very funny book. I feel like she has a lot of quirky one-liners that I just love in those books. So for me, this was a 4-star. Again, it is not life-changing by any means, but it is just such an enjoyable read. I absolutely love reading her books. They are books that I would like to reread because they're just so cute and easy to read. So if you are ever in a reading slump, or if you just want something that's super easy, brain off, it's just cute, it's like watching a rom-com but reading, Ali Hazelwood is your author. All right, I have another romance book coming up, and that is Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I've heard so much about this author, so many good things, and I finally got a copy of one of her books from my Book of the Month subscription, and I was super excited to read it. This was a 4-star book, and if I'm being completely honest, when I was getting ready to film this and I was kind of listing out all of the books, this is the book I remember the least about. And I don't know why, because I gave this a 4 stars when I read it. I remember enjoying it, but I don't know, it's really not standing out in my memory. Like, I can't really remember the characters' names. I just kind of remember like the basic plot of it. So I guess incorporate that into this review, as I rated it as good, but I don't remember that much about it. In this book, we are following these two doctors who meet at their workplace, the hospital, and they kind of get off on the wrong foot. They hate each other for the most part in the beginning, but they start writing these letters to each other and developing a kind of, friendliness towards each other. Then the male doctor realizes that the female doctor has a brother who's on dialysis and is looking for kidney. I was right, it's kidney. The male doctor realizes he is a match for the female doctor's younger brother who is in need of a kidney, so he decides to anonymously donate this kidney. At the same time, the male doctor is kind of in a little bit of a situation with his family. His brother is marrying his ex. I can't remember if it's his ex-girlfriend or his ex-wife. And things are just a little bit awkward about it in general with him and his brother, him and his family. It's just all weird. So he comes up with a lie to say that he's moved on and he's madly in love with this other doctor at his workplace. And unfortunately for him, his family ends up thinking that this female doctor that he's donating a kidney to save her brother is this person that he's made up. So she ends up getting involved in this scheme to kind of trick his family while they go to the wedding so that they don't feel sorry for him, basically having to watch his brother marry his ex. The book itself is really good. I do remember that. I just don't remember that many plot points, but it was good. I remember liking the writing style of this book. It's not as cutesy as like an Ali Hazelwood. It's a little bit more adult, but it's a very mature romance that I really enjoyed. I just can't remember that much about it for some reason. I don't know why, but it was a 4 stars when I read it. Maybe I'd knock it down to like a 3.5 now since I can't really remember it too well, but I do remember enjoying it. So, all right, we are switching back to nonfiction. So I read The 100 Years' War in Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, and this book has been highly recommended by so many people. So many sources, so many social media outlets have recommended this book. And honestly, I agree, and I'm going to join the voices. You need to read this book if you haven't already. This book goes over the history between Palestine and Israel within the past 100 years and kind of lays the foundation for the current events that are going on right now, the current genocide that is happening in Palestine by Israel. I will say one of the things I really liked about this book is that it's pretty easy to understand. It's not super complicated. I feel like I tend to steer away from history books because I just feel like it's going to be really boring or it's going to be kind of dense and just difficult to remember what happened and all of that. But I feel like Rashid did a very, very good job in making it understandable for the average person, kind of summarizing everything so well that you really remember the contents of this book. And maybe it's partially because of what's currently going on that everything just really like lasered itself into my brain. But this book, it just captured me. It's just so much history involving the United States, which is where I live, that isn't talked about, that was unknown to me until I read this book and until I learned more and educated myself. Another thing I really like about this author is it's not very one-sided. It's very much like these are the players in the game. This is how they contributed to what's going on. This is why this is their responsibility to help end it. And he's also very candid about the things on the Palestinian end that have gone wrong, where there have been extremist groups that have risen up and they've done things, they've committed actions that have actually hurt their own cause. He also talks explicitly about kind of the difference in politics between the West and in the Arab nations. And I found that just very fascinating, that a lot of the conflict that's happening is due to differences in how politics work, and the West kind of being a very deceiving political way of working, where it's very common for people to lie in politics in the West, and your word doesn't really mean a whole lot. And because of those discrepancies between how Western politics work versus how politics in like Arab nations work, it led to a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of broken promises, and just a lot of conflict in general. I will say that if you are someone in the US who is thinking, why does the US have to get involved at all? Why is it our responsibility to help Palestine? This book will definitely make it very clear to you why it is our responsibility to help the Palestinians, because we are one of the major players that enacted and allowed and funded the genocide that is currently going on. All in all, to say, this was a 5-star book from me. I highly recommend reading it. I feel like this is one of the foundational reads just to understand what's going on, to put context behind everything that's happening, and also to understand the propaganda that we're facing in our current day and age. Because even on the US side, yes, there is propaganda. It has been going on for a long time. They control the narrative about what we see, what we think, because it influences the money that politicians get. So I'll stop my little rampage, but Read this book. It is so good. 5 stars. All right, another nonfiction book coming at you. I told you I've been reading so much more nonfiction recently. Next up, we have Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. This was such a fun nonfiction read. I think it's called pop nonfiction whenever it's kind of like introduced in a very, I don't know, easily digestible way, but this was one of those books. It was a very fun book to read, a little bit comedic, just very interesting. And as someone who majored in linguistics in college, I absolutely adore talking about language, the impact of language on people's decisions and on society as a whole. So having a whole book talking about the language of cults was just right up my alley. Now, this book doesn't just cover cults, although it does talk about some of the more popular cults that have happened throughout the history, specifically towards the United States cult history. But it mainly talks about the language and the tactics and techniques used by cults to get people to join their cults, stay in the cults, and eventually commit heinous acts. It's really interesting. I'd say one of the main points about this book that I just found so fascinating was her emphasis that people always think that people that get, adopted into a cult, what's the word? People that join cults are stupid, or they're, gullible, or they're very easy to talk into things. But she really explores that that's not true. Most cults don't go for people that they see as uneducated. They go for well-mannered, well-educated people. But the kind of loose point, the thing that normally gets people is their want for community. She points out that humans are very socially based creatures. We crave community, we have evolved towards community, and we live in a world right now where there isn't a whole lot of community naturally around us. And cults can kind of exploit this weakness by offering these potential havens for people that are really seeking community of like-minded individuals. One of my favorite parts about this book is that it doesn't necessarily just focus on cults. She kind of dives into how cult language is utilized in different things. So you have cults, but you also have exercise clubs like Orange Theory. You also have advertisements and political leaders. They all utilize cult language, and she kind of breaks down this language specifically so that you can more easily recognize when someone is using culty language to try to get you to participate or join a certain group. And sometimes these groups are not all bad. Orange Theory is not the devil. They are actually very good for you, and I've done it myself, and it's a lot of fun. But it's still culty language because as humans, we want to be in a cult. We want to be in groups of people. And she just fabulously breaks it down so you can kind of recognize that language and kind of see exactly how people get brought into these things and why they're willing to sacrifice literally everything, sacrifice their family, their friends, their lives for these groups. This was a 4-star read for me. I loved it. It was a good book. Not a 5-star, I would say, but still a very good read. I'm so excited to show you my next book because it's so pretty. That is The Sirens by Amelia Hart. Just look at this book. It is just gorgeous. Got the edges. I love this book. Now, I don't know if you're all familiar with Amelia Hart, but this is her second book, I believe, that she's released. I read her first book, Wayward, and loved that book. I know there's some controversy over whether people love or hate that book. I was one of the people that loved it. So when I saw that she had another book coming out called The Sirens, I was super excited. If you're not very familiar with Amelia Hart's work, she does kind of like speculative fiction, I guess you could say. It's like speculative historical fiction. It feels like our world, but there's like a little bit of a fantasy element. For example, with Wayward, the fantasy element was witches. With this one, the fantasy element is sirens. So I was super excited to read this book. For me, this was a 4-star read. I really liked the way that this novel was done. It's very similar to how Wayward was done. We're looking at these 2 different timelines, these 2 seemingly unrelated characters, and she's able to weave 2 different narratives into one long continuous story. She did it with Wayward, she did it with this one, and for some reason, I just love the way that she executes this. I normally am not a big fan of books that have multiple point of views, but for some reason, when Amelia Hart does it, I'm fine with it. I love it, actually. Now, in this book, we're focusing on 3 different timelines, 3 different stories. The first one takes place in the 1800s as we follow these 2 young sisters who were on a slave boat heading to North America. Their mother drowned when they were young, so they've always been terrified of the ocean, but as they're stuck on this ship, they have no choice but to face their fears as they are completely surrounded by water and by people that hate them. The second timeline takes place in 1999, where we follow another main character, Jess, who has this really weird skin condition that makes her allergic to water, and she's always kind of felt like an outcast because of the way that this allergy makes her skin appear, but she starts to get attention from her art teacher, and this kind of changed how she feels about herself and how she feels about him. And the final timeline is in 2019, where I would say our main character takes place, and that is Lucy, who wakes up in the middle of the night to herself sleepwalking and choking her ex-lover in the middle of the night. She's never sleptwalked before. She doesn't know why she was choking him, but she's forced to run in the middle of the night before the police are called to escape what she's done. She feels like her life has been ruined. She didn't kill him. She just almost killed him, and he was aware that it was her. And she's forced to flee to her sister's house a few towns over that's on the coast. And while she's there, she ends up discovering more about herself and her sister than she ever could have imagined. The way that she writes, I think, really encapsulates me. I will say, if you're getting into this book because you're like, oh my gosh, I really want this fantasy novel about sirens, this isn't going to be it. It is speculative fiction. It is very much reality, which is like a touch of sirens, just like a touch of fantasy. So it's not going to be super overboard there, but it is just a really good book, especially when it comes to the dynamic of sisters. And I loved it. I would recommend it. It's a gorgeous book. I feel like it's going to be similar to Wayward, where you'll either love it or you'll hate it. But for me, I loved it. And we're back to nonfiction with The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodall. This book was such an interesting read for it being summertime in the American South. Very interesting. This book really goes over global warming and climate change, but very specifically the heat aspect of global warming, how that heat will impact us. And he offers very specific examples of how the heat is already impacting us, of how trees are starting to lose their leaves in the summer like they do in fall because they can't withstand the heat, or all of the heat-related deaths that we're already experiencing in the United States. This was such an interesting read, but also a little bit of a horrifying read at the same time, because you can't help but feel the sense of helplessness as an individual. But I also think that this book is really good at kind of opening your eyes to the reality of what's at stake, of what needs to be done. Especially, he addresses this argument of people kind of have this belief that we can just invent ourselves out of facing climate crisis, or we can evolve with the climate crisis. But he really points out that the changes are happening at too fast of a rate for us to really be able to do that. And he lists very specific examples and research for why we should take action now, why we should care now versus waiting until later, especially because majority of the people that are going to be affected by the climate crisis, at least at first, are third world countries and the poor. This was a 5-star read for me. Honestly, it's still summer right now here in the South, and I can't help but go outside when it's really hot right now and think about this book and think about all of the information presented in this book. He does it in a way that's very easy to understand. It was honestly an enjoyable read, despite it being, a little bit horrifying and anxiety inducing, but still a very good read. I think it's super beneficial to read to understand, again, what's really at stake, especially when it comes to this severe heat. So I highly recommend this. This was a 5-star read for me. It's a little intense, so make sure you're in the right headspace when you read it, because it's intense. All right, this next book is actually a witchy book. It's the only witchy book that I really read this year, unfortunately. And this is Wild Witchcraft, Folk Herbalism, Garden Magic, and Foraging for Spells, Rituals, and Remedies by Rebecca Beyer. I have had this book for such a long time. I think it is an absolutely gorgeous book, actually. I adore the way this book looks. But I haven't read it. I've literally had this book for maybe 2 years. Never once have I cracked it open, so I decided to open it because a book club that I'm part of was reading it, and I really liked this book. Honestly, for me, I would say this book is probably like a 4-star, 4.5-star book. It's not what I thought it was going to be. A lot of times when you read witchy books, it's very theory-based, a lot of just information. You can kind of read it front to back. But this one is more of like a resource book. It really talks about how to garden, how to compost, how to ethically forage, all of these different things. It also gives you some herbal profiles, so different profiles on plants and their uses and how to take care of them. And it was more of like a resource book than like a read front to back book, but I still really enjoyed it. The art within the book itself was absolutely gorgeous, and I just loved the way that she talked about plants. She really had an emphasis on building a relationship with plants, and you can tell she has that connection, that she has that relationship. And so it was a really good book. I think some people might be disappointed because it isn't a very magic focused book. It's definitely much more a gardening book, a fostering a relationship and connection with plants book. But I personally don't see that as a bad thing. So I'd recommend this. Again, probably like a 4-star, 4.5-star book, but it's absolutely gorgeous. All right, my last physical book that I'm going to be covering, and one of the better books that I have read this year, is The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness by Jonathan Haidt. What's really interesting about this book is that this author, he wrote another book think it's like The Coddling of the American Mind. I tried to read that book a few years ago, and I hated his voice. I hated his voice. I hated his tone. I could not finish the book. I DNF'd it. But then I saw this book in one of my local bookstores, and it just called to me. It just called to me, and I'm glad it did because I absolutely loved reading this book. Again, this is a nonfiction book, but it was one of the more interesting ones that I've read. And despite me not having children, I found it absolutely fascinating. This book really talks over the connection between the increase in anxiety, depression, suicide, male loneliness, and rage, and the introduction of the smartphone and unlimited access to the internet for children in the early 2000s. Jonathan really targets that in the 90s and the early 2000s, parents kind of stopped letting their kids have that independence, that risky play that is really needed for childhood development. This is mainly due to because of the internet, because of parents having more access to information, they were able to see more news, find out more horrors of the world, and as a result, not want to let their kids go out by themselves. So the same parents that were allowed to walk themselves to school at the age of 8 now won't even let their 10-year-old go hang out at a friend's house, or won't let their 10-year-old go into the grocery store by themselves because they're terrified. At the same time that they are overprotecting their kids from the real world, they kind of let their kids have free reign online during this time when family computers were a thing, and then eventually when smartphones were introduced, kids were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted. As a child that grew up during that period of time where I was allowed basically unlimited access to the internet whenever I wanted, yeah, there was a lot going on. There was a lot that should have been supervised that wasn't, mostly because parents just didn't know to do it at that time. You know, you kind of live and you learn. But he really talks over the effects of having this unlimited access to the internet and this kind of overprotectiveness in reality, and how it really stunted a lot of social development and emotional growth for children. Specifically for girls were affected the most with high rates of anxiety and depression. However, boys were also affected with a lot more male loneliness and rage that would come out. I definitely recommend reading this book if you're a parent. He does have a lot more parent related advice and anecdotes, and of course I don't have kids, but I just found it all very fascinating on what he thinks is the right pathway moving forward in terms of how we regulate children's online use. He has these guidelines he's kind of come up with for when to give your kid a smartphone, when to give your kid social media access, these kinds of things. But he also talks over parents kind of needing to let go. You need to let your child have risky play. Them climbing the jungle gym and having the risk of falling off and breaking their arm is how they learn how to do those things, how to not fall off and break their arm, how to trust that they're able to do tasks by themselves, that they don't always need a parent hovering behind them, there to catch them. And I found that very interesting as someone who grew up during the time period that's basically being analyzed. And it was just very interesting to see how social media and the internet and smartphones as a whole have kind of affected children or continuing to affect children. So again, I don't have kids, but I just found this super interesting to see the correlations between it, since I was kind of the first generation that was really affected by it. So who knows, maybe my anxiety spiral earlier this year was caused by my smartphone. It probably was. I wouldn't be surprised. It's an issue. But for me, this was a 5-star book. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it, especially if you are a parent or if you are someone that struggles with being on your phone. Again, a lot of what he talks about in this book is more related to children specifically because their brains are developing. But I also think that adults have a problem with phone use, internet use, and not socializing. So I would take some of the same advice that was featured in this book as well. But I highly recommend it. It was a very good book. Definitely preferred his tone in this book more than I did in The Coddling of the American Mind. So 5 stars. All right. And the last book that I've read so far this year, I finished it last week actually, is The Tenet by Freida McFadden. Now, I don't have a physical copy of this book. I read it as an ebook, and I'm actually not a huge Freida McFadden fan. I have read 2 of her other books. I think it's the Housemaid series, and I actually did enjoy the Housemaid series, but I did see there was a little bit of controversy, of course nothing confirmed, but that she potentially might have stolen some of the concepts for her books from other authors. So keeping that in mind, this book was the first book in a book club that I have joined. One of my friends locally has started a book club called Books and Brews. If you're in the Central Arkansas area, feel free to comment and you can maybe join our book club. But our first book that we're all reading together was The Tenet. Now, Freida McFadden does a bunch of thrillers. That's kind of her realm of experience, and I did enjoy the Housemaid series. I didn't see anything super controversial about The Tenet itself. I believe this might be her new release, but I decided to go ahead and read it, and honestly, it was a very easy read. I read this in one sitting at I started at 6 p.m. I think I finished by maybe 8 p.m., 9 p.m. I finished it so fast. Now, for me personally, this book was a 2.5 stars. And I know I just went on about how it's such an easy read, and it was an easy read. You're not going to read it and like get stuck because it's dense or because there's nothing, you know, interesting about it. It's an interesting book. The writing style is mainly what I had a problem with. The way this book was written was just, in my opinion, kind of poorly done. It felt a little bit like a Wattpad fan fiction. And if you know, you know, but that was the vibe it kind of gave off. The writing style just felt very immature, just not what you would expect from a very accomplished writer with as many books out as she does. In the back of my mind, I almost wonder if this was a book she was kind of rushed to put out, and that's why it kind of reads the way that it does. But again, that's just my opinion. Some people did love the book. Just for me, it felt a little bit off. Another reason that this book was 2.5 stars is because the main character is unbearable. And he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be a character that you don't really like. At least I hope to God. If he's a character that you're supposed to love, she missed the mark completely. He was very hateable, and I did hate him. And unfortunately for me, I don't really enjoy reading books that have bad main characters, even intentionally bad main characters, because for me, I end up not caring what happens to them. If I don't really like them, then I'm like, okay, well, what do I care if they meet their goal or if they have all these bad things happen to them? I don't like them. They're a bad person. And that's kind of what happened in this book, where I just didn't like the main character to the point I didn't care what happened to him. Every time something bad happened, I was like, cool, because I didn't care. And I don't think that was a great way to kind of lead the story, because this felt like one of those stories where if you did care about the main character, it would have been a horrifying book for everything that was happening. Now, just to clue you in on what this book is about, this book follows this married couple, and they decide to rent out a room in their house. I think it's a house. It's either like a house or like a condo, townhouse kind of thing. They decide to rent out one of the rooms in the house because they are a little short on money, as the husband is currently out of a job and is looking for a new one. Now, they find a woman to move in, and she seems to be really nice, very kind, and so they agree to let her move in. But not long after she moves in, she develops this hatred toward the husband. And they kind of get this like weird relationship where they're both just doing things to piss the other off. And it starts off small with just like snide comments and making faces and things like that, but it slowly kind of escalates. Now, this whole book is from the husband's point of view. And he feels like he's going insane because this tenant of theirs is doing these god-awful things. She's purposefully leaving trash out, she's making noise at night to keep him up, and she's acting completely normal to his wife, so it seems like he's going insane, like he's making a problem out of nothing, and it's driving him crazy. So the whole book is following this relationship with having this tenant that's literally crazy and doing all these things, and him trying not to lose his mind and trying to figure out what to do about it. Now again, for me, it was 2.5 stars. It was just fine. Some people really liked it. I think a lot of people don't think this is like the strongest of her books, and I would have to agree. I wouldn't read it again, and honestly, I don't think I would really recommend it to that many people either. It was just a very average book, and again, I think the writing style had a big part in that. The unlikable characters. I was actually asked in the book club who my favorite character was, and I said their pet goldfish because didn't really care for any of the other characters. Like at all. I didn't care. It was and the ending wasn't very satisfying. I feel like there was a lot of very cliche moments in the book. So yeah, was not my favorite. I don't really know what happened with this one because I've heard a lot of people say that they love Freida McFadden's writing, and this one was a miss. It really was. All right, and with that was the last book that I've read so far this year. Thank you so much if you've made it this far in the video. I definitely hope to read more books before the end of the year. I think I've gotten in a much better pacing and schedule of reading. I actually have like 4 books right now that I'm working on all at once. So hopefully I'll have a lot more books I can update you on at the end of the year, but this is what we have for now. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned, please let me know your thoughts on them down below, and let me know what you're reading right now. Or alternatively, if you're not reading anything, let me know what your favorite or your least favorite book of the year so far has been. I would love to hear it. I'm always looking for more book recommendations, and I also love talking shit about bad books, so both of those things work out for me. Again, I'm so sorry I haven't been super active on this channel in a while. I'm hoping to change that moving forward, but thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like down below, and if you want to see more of this or more of me in general, feel free to subscribe to my channel. But with that, that's all I have, so I'll talk to you baddies later. Bye!